Now let's look at pollination and breeding in plants. Pollination is a process, of course, you should understand if you're going to be doing any kind of plant breeding or study of plants. And it's a natural process, but breeding is a process where humans actually get involved in directed pollination for development of certain species and cultivars. Pollination is when pollen moves from the male part of the flower, the stamen, to the female part of the flower, the pistil. Then the pollen grain sits there on the top there of the pistil, and it has to germinate and grow a little pollen tube all the way down into the ovary where it delivers the pollen sperm to the egg. So pollination is different than fertilization. The time it takes for that pollen grain to move from the stigma and grow a tube down and deliver the sperm can be a few hours to quite a few months. So pollination and fertilization are separated in time. Cross-pollination is where two plants are involved. Pollen from one plant on a flower on one plant travels to a flower on a second plant and pollinates it. Self-pollination is where it all happens on one plant. So you can have pollen from one flower get on the stigma of another flower of that same plant, or it can happen all in one flower also. This is an example of a forced self-pollination. This plant has this ways that it makes sure that it only pollinates itself. It's called cleistogamous. It means the flowers don't open, and so it has to self-pollinate because nothing else can get into the flower except its own pollen and sperm. So in this violet, the flower remains underground and never opens, forcing self-pollination. And you're seeing the soil was removed around the crown to expose these flowers and the fruits that were all self-pollinated and never opened up to receive anything outside of that same flower. Cross-pollination can happen from wind blowing the pollen from one flower or one flower on a plant to another plant, or it can happen by insects. Insect-pollinated plants usually have brightly colored flowers to attract the insects and maybe some kind of nectar to attract the insects too. Flowers that are blue, yellow are often insect-pollinated. Red flowers are often bird-pollinated, and often plants pollinated by birds the flowers don't have much of a scent because birds can't really smell much. So it would be kind of a waste for that flower to produce a scent if it wasn't for attracting the bird. And I mean, it wouldn't be, so it just wouldn't make any sense. White flowers are often something that's pollinated by moths, sometimes bats, because that color is most visible at night. Wind-pollinated flowers tend to be kind of long and dangly and sticking out into the, away from the tree a little bit, so the wind can come by and float the pollen around. It's easy access. In some ways, they remind me of underwater kind of organisms that are structured the same way to receive, like fish will produce their sperm and kind of let it loose into an egg bed, and so everything is spread out to receive as much as possible. Like these catkins on this in image C, these are long male flower catkins, a whole bunch of male flowers in this long dangly thing where the wind can come by and blow the pollen off and get it to the female flower, which is this little shorter thing called the stigma sticking out there to catch some of that pollen. And similar in this spruce. The male cones produce the pollen and it floats, it's blown by the wind, floating away over to the female cone, which is not shown. Of course, we all know bees are a great pollinator, and they provide pollination for something like this sunflower seed crop or a commercial fruit orchard. A lot of orchards now and even some farms will rent beehives like this for a couple of months so everything can get pollinated and the fruits will be developed, optimized fertilization and development of those fruits for better yields and sales. As we already learned about, plants that have separate male and female plants are called dioecious. And those plants, when pollination occurs, it has to involve two plants. This picture on the left is showing you a holly flowers or ilex, and they're dioecious with male plants and female plants. The males and female flowers are on separate plants, so two plants have to be involved. It has to be cross-pollination. The same is true for cannabis, although sometimes there's hermaphroditic cannabis plants, or they can become that way, but that's more the exception. The other type is Monitious plants. So we have separate male and female plants are dioecious. When you have separate male and female flowers all on the same plant, they're called Monitious. And so pollination has to include 2 flowers, but not 2 plants, just 2 flowers on that plant. Examples are things like walnut or pecan. They have separate male and female flowers on the same plant. Another way to ensure that the flower doesn't self-fertilize is this process called dichogamy, and that is the plant has this strategy where the flower cannot pollinate itself. The stamens that produce the pollen, the male part, and the pistil that produces, that receives the pollen and produces the eggs, they're receptive at different times. So within one flower, you would not have the stamens and the pistil mature at the same time. Pollen would not be produced when the stigma is receptive. They'll be at different times to make sure that even though they're on the same plant, they're ensuring some kind of movement of pollen from one flower to the other. And each one will have different genetics, so it does ensure some genetic diversity. Another example of just maintaining some bit of diversity if a plant is self-pollinating is called heterostyle, and that is when one flower's stigma, or the pistil, is taller than the anthers. So just by gravity, the pollen usually won't float upwards to the stigma there on that. It might float down to the stigmas on flowers below it, but not within the same flower. Again, promoting genetic diversity, even if it's just within that same self-pollinating plant. Cross-pollination is really important for maintaining genetic diversity. You have the sperm and the eggs from different flowers and different plants mixing and creating more diversity, and that's really important in maintaining diversity in crops, especially if they're being cloned over and over. So the diversity inherent in the seeds is saved over many generations instead of slowly diminished. Cross-pollination or crossing is utilized in plant breeding and can be done in the greenhouse after a flower is hand-pollinated, humans moving pollen from one flower, the stamen of one flower, to the stigma of another. Individual flowers can be covered with a little mesh bag, and so no other pollen can get in through insects or wind. And in that way, what you're crossing is controlled, the flowers that are involved. And if you have something specific you're trying to do by breeding certain flowers with other flowers and plants. And to control pollination in plants like crops out in a field, you can do that in a couple of ways. Field crops can be isolated, so they're not near related species. There's a big buffer of space so that pollinators wouldn't fly that far, or the wind wouldn't carry the pollen that far and get onto other species that you don't want them to. They also can be open pollinated, like this carrot crop on the right, allowing pollination between the individual plants, but still isolated from preventing cross-pollination with wild species or other crops nearby by some type of spatial buffer zone. A hybrid cross involves taking pollen from one species and placing it on the stigma of another species. Here's an example of an eggplant breeding program where on the left in A, they're removing the petals and stamens, emasculating they call it, and then B, of exposing the female pistil. So they didn't expose it before they took off the pollen to make sure that same flower's pollen didn't get on the pistil of that flower. And then placing the pollen on the receptive stigma, covering the pollinated flower with foil to exclude any kind of other pollen getting in, and then letting the seeds develop. Seeds developed from a hybrid cross can be tested by being planted out. In this example below, you're seeing the white-flowered seedling, probably from a seed from one of the inbred parent lines that was mistakenly harvested with the hybrid seed, so that would be rooted out if you're trying to sell purple petunia seeds.